Welcome to this episode of Ukraine Story Podcast. This is DW. I'm here today with Honor. Honor, it's great to have you here, but we have a very special guest today, and we've been waiting some time and are excited to talk to Terry. Terry, you are an illustrious astronaut, F-16 fighter pilot. We want to talk to you about your history in the astronaut corps. We also want to talk to you about Ukraine because you have some unique perspectives on that. Can you take us back in time? As I understand it, you have lived on the ISS with Russians. You have lived in Finland. You have visited Estonia. You began your career as an F-16 pilot. Today you're on the road speaking to groups all across America, writing books, producing films, and you get some important messages about freedom and the future of the world. But can you take me back to the beginning? Give our viewers who are unfamiliar with your career a little bit of backdrop on the journey that you've been on.
Sure. Well, as a kid, the first book I read was about Apollo. And so I grew up wanting to be an astronaut and a pilot. I had pictures of galaxies and actually the space shuttle, the all-white space shuttle was on my wall. The original red, white, and blue F-16 that flew 50 years ago last week, I think, for the first time. So that's what I grew up. And then in high school, I did this an exchange. I lived with a family in Finland with a group called I.S.S, and it was awesome. I just loved it. My first time in Europe, and I really kind of fell in love with it. But I lived in this small town called Imatra, which is in the southeast of Finland. It's in a region called Karelia that the Soviets took from Finland after World War II. And our house was on a lake, and in the middle of the lake there was a buoys, like a line, and on one side was the Soviet Union, and on our side was Finland. So I was about a kilometer from the Soviet Union as a high school kid. And I had been like fascinated by 1984, the Orwell book. Ironically, I was there in 1984. And I was fascinated to see the Russian tourists who would come over. They walked in line and they stayed together. They couldn't like leave their little tour group. And so I was fascinated by it. And I realized what a huge threat, in the 80s, especially that time, man, there was a threat of nuclear war. And so I joined the Air Force, and my thinking was I want to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. I knew that they really were the evil empire. And to quote Ronald Reagan, I really admired his vision, his willingness to stand up to evil, because that's what it was. And I didn't know that much about Eastern Europe, and I had no idea about Eastern Europe until I lived in Finland, which is, the easternmost Scandinavian country. And they have a book called The Unknown Soldier by Väinö Linna. It's a really famous book in Finland. It's about World War II. And they just had an interesting history where they were right in between Germany and Russia, right? Like, and it's the same in Estonia and Latvia and Poland and Ukraine. And they're in this zone of the world where it's either the Russians coming or the Germans coming. So that really fascinated me. And I did 10 years flying F-16s. I was actually, my favorite time of my life probably was 3.5 years where I was based in Germany. Ironically, it was in the 90s, so the Cold War was definitely winding down, but we still had a nuclear mission. So I was a nuke pilot. I had a town in the former Warsaw Pact that was my town. I knew everything about it, how to find it on the radar, and how many kilotons my bomb would be. So that was kind of a humbling experience. So I ended up at NASA, was able to fly after a long wait. There was a lot of stuff happened in the 2000s. I eventually flew as a space shuttle pilot, and then went up with the Russians on a Soyuz, spent a little bit over 7 months on the International Space Station. And I loved Russia. I learned the Russian language. I learned the culture. I met lots of Russian friends. I launched from the same launch pad that Yuri Gagarin launched from. I loved it. But when I went over for my last flight, I went over for some Russian language training, and I showed up on Dane Pobjedi, May 9th, their victory day. And I remember thinking, this is really weird. It almost feels like a cult. Like there's posters everywhere, and the Moscow was lit. It was like the 4th of July. And I remember thinking, I bet you most Americans don't even know when VE Day. Well, when was the day that Hitler was gone? But when do we win in Europe? The answer is May 8th, and the Soviets celebrated on May 9th because they just wanted a different day than us. In fact, the Soviet general that signed, here's an interesting fact, on May 8th, along with the Americans and the French and the Brits, he got disappeared, never heard from again. Because Stalin was mad that, that he signed on our side. So the thing that I noticed was, man, this is like a cult. I mean, it feels more like a religion. Like the two things in Russia that the government celebrates to a fault, like they celebrate too much, is Yuri Gagarin launching and this World War II victory. And I've asked some like educated people my age, some business leaders and stuff, who was the first American in space? And they all say John Glenn, like they don't remember that it was Alan Shepard. And no one knows what they won in Europe. My point is, like, we've kind of moved on since then. We've done other things since we won World War II. But Russia hasn't. They are stuck in the past. And that obsession with the past, combined with the egotistical dictator who's dictator for life, when you combine those things, it's turned into this absolute nightmare that Russia has created. And they've been, for the last century, I could go, I'm sorry to talk. We need to have a conversation.
No, this is very important. I actually would like to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Russia has developed a hagiography of its own role in the Second World War. It's developed a historical revisionism,
Yeah,
which posits itself as the victor. They are the reason why World War II came to end.
right.
It seems to have somehow eradicated the memory of the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact that took place between Nazi Germany and Russia. It seems to have presented to the people of Russia this idea: we are the good, we are glorious Russia. Under Stalin, we were the good, the glorious Russia. And our battle against the West, even though we were aligned with them for part of the war, and against Nazism, is the perpetual battle that Russia fights. And thus that becomes the prelude to the invasion of Ukraine later, that without the mythology of Russia's role in World War II, they wouldn't have the sort of cultural impetus behind the mission of driving out Nazis from Ukraine.
Yeah. DW, you hit it. It's like in 1984, there are these three big entities that are always at war with each other. And it's the same thing in Russia. The West is always against Russia and they have to fight back, which is not true at all. Everything about Russian society is based on a lie. The entire society foundation is a lie. And the people know basically that the government lies, and it's like just a social contract. They're like, yeah, but it's not an entire lie. There's always a little bit of truth somewhere in the lie, but the people just accept it, that that's what they are going to do. The government just says these outrageous things constantly, and this narrative that Putin has created. The problem is, if you tell somebody a lie, and the grosse Lüge is the German word for what Hitler called it. Hitler was like the original varsity level propagandist, and Putin just does exactly what Hitler did with the big lie. But everything about the society is based on a lie. And to your point about World War II, every time the Russians are like, when I criticize them, they'll say, well, what did my grandfather fight for? My grandfather fought. It's always grandfathers. Like now it's probably great grandfathers, but they always say it's their grandfather. The question I asked them is, are you talking about when he was fighting for Hitler, on the side of Hitler, or after he started fighting against Hitler? What period are you talking about when your grandfather was fighting? And I asked a educated, very highly educated, professional Russian person recently, they did not know that Russia was on the side of Hitler for a year and a half. It wasn't until the Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Russia invaded Poland a couple weeks after Germany did. Like they had the whole thing divvied up. We'll take part of Poland. We'll take um, the Baltics. We'll take Ukraine, or they already had Ukraine, but um, they just had no idea that this had happened. The Holodomor, you know, I'm sure we know about the Holodomor. For the listeners who don't know, the Soviet Union starved millions of Ukrainians to death. And I thought it was just 1932, 33. There's a really good Oscar nominated movie. It just came out a couple years ago called Mr. Jones. Yeah, Jones with the Russian yeah instead of R. Um, it's about how the Soviets created this massive man-made starvation famine in Ukraine. And I didn't know this. There's a Ukrainian family that lives in my neighborhood, and every time I go there for 5 minutes or for just to drop something off, it ends up being an hour-long Thanksgiving feast. So during this, there was actually 3 starvations that Stalin did, with 32, 33, later in the 30s, and then right after World War II, where anyway, these are just things that Russian people don't know. Certainly Americans don't know it, but it's a history of a century of Russian evil. Like everything, Russia's probably been the worst promoter of human misery for the last century. As an F-16 pilot, every enemy that I had to train and prepare for, they all fly MiG-29s. They all have SA-6s and SA-3s and SA-8, all the old Russian surface-to-air missiles. North Korea and Iran are really serious friends. And the bad thing is they both have nuclear ambition. North Korea has nukes. Iran may soon. And they're providing Russian with weapons. They're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. I'm sure Russia is helping North Korea with their missile technology and Iran to develop nuclear bombs. It's really, really, really serious. And although those in the modern Republican Party think that we can just ignore it, and a nuclear armed Iran is not something that we can ignore. And the threat to all of Europe and NATO is not something we can ignore. And North Korean missiles that actually work is not something that we can ignore. So it's just time for us in the West to open our eyes to the reality of what's happening.
We have so much to talk about here, and everything you're saying opens up a door for actually, I think, a very vital conversation. I want to explore more about your journey living in Moscow, going on the I.S.S. But before we do, because we've been talking about World War II, and you lived in Finland, which what a history Finland has between Nazis and Germans. Do you see parallels between the events leading up to Hitler's push, the events leading up to World War II, and the events that are unfolding between Putin, Ukraine, and the West today? Is there a connection there between World War II that we can learn from today?
It's so ridiculous how glaringly obvious there are parallels. And there's so many, profound parallels. If you were going to write a script 20 years ago, people would just laugh at you like, that already happened in World War II. It's not going to happen again. You always hear this thing, never again. I was just in Auschwitz a couple months ago, and it just struck me. Like everybody always says never again about the Holocaust, and it's happening again. It's a different situation in Russia, but that industrial scale war has come to Europe again, which is just unbelievable. So in World War II, you had a dictator for life who had grievances against the rest of the world, who had this narrative that everybody's out to get him, who had a narrative that people in the German-speaking people in the Sudetenland were being harmed and they needed to be protected. And they just want a little bit of Czechoslovakia and Sudetenland and just a little bit here and there, maybe some Poland, and then we'll have peace in our time, as Neville Chamberlain said. And then look what happened. And so we're in that exact same, spot. Hitler wanted to bring back the glories of Otto von Bismarck and whatever. Putin wants to be Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, and the glories of the Soviet Union. So the parallels are 100% true.
Would you agree that does this sync work in your own thinking? It seems to me Hitler made three basic arguments, and you've pointed them out, and we'll just kind of synthesize them. Argument number one is we need to rescue liberated Germans in other areas. Putin has made the argument in the East, in Luhansk, Donbass, et cetera, Crimea, everywhere, he's rescuing the Russian speakers. And then in the main invasion, we're rescuing the people who will welcome us from the Nazi overlords. The second thing, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, is that he said, we need to restore the ancient lands, the lands that really belong to us. Hitler said that. And now we have Vladimir Putin saying, we just want to restore the Soviet Union. We just want to bring back the borders and the territories of the Soviet Union. Oh, and by the way, in case you were wondering my opinion on Alaska, I made the announcement 2 weeks ago that that treaty was invalid, and Seward's Folly, that belongs to Russia as well. So just to put it out there, it all belongs to us and we're coming back. And that was also a point that Hitler made. And then the third point is we need a buffer zone from the evil West.
Right.
And those are the 3 points of Putin. We need a buffer zone, we need to rescue Russians, and we need to restore territorial lands. It's almost carbon copy, the arguments.
It's insane, the parallels. And doing my speaking, I do a lot of public speaking with National Geographic and with corporate events. And for several years after I left NASA, I would say, folks, it really feels like the 1930s. Like 1940 is not that far away. It really felt, well, now it's 1943. I mean, it's actually more 1916, I think, what's happening in Ukraine. Hopefully 1918 will happen soon. Militarily, it's closer to World War I than it is World War II, but that's a different story. The point that Putin's there to rescue Russians, the grand irony of that is the reasons there's Russians there is because they try and Russify the country they're with. Like they've imported, I don't know, 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of Russians into Crimea, and they kick out the Crimean Tatars, and the ethnic locals get completely abused, and it's basically a genocide. It's getting rid of one people and replacing them with Russian. What they've done with the kids in Ukraine that's why Putin's a war criminal.
Okay, you mentioned the kids. Are you referring to the kidnapping of between 20,000 and 100,000 Ukrainian children?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the International Criminal Court has an arrest warrant out for Vladimir Putin. That's why he can't travel to every country that he wants to. He's limited because, in theory, somebody would have to arrest him. But the point I was trying to make is, they ship in all these Russians, and then they have a vote. Hey, who wants to be part of Russia? Well, all the Ukrainians have left, and all the Russians that they shipped in vote for that.
So there are many parallels. The world is from World War II. The arguments are the same. What about the response from the West? Leading up to World War II, in the years that led up, in 1933, 91 years ago, this week, at the time of the recording of this podcast, a Western journalist met with Hitler to hear his opinion. And Hitler's comments were, look, I'm a man of peace. I want peace. I'm just asking for peace. That's what I'm all about. That was his first comments. And then leading up to the invasion of the Sudetenland and the events of 1939, we saw this birth of a movement called America First, and it was an isolationist movement. Men like Charles Lindbergh in America championed the cause. And the speeches that they were giving out there had a lot of different elements to it. It was anger at the moral decay of the West. It was pleasure with what Germany was doing to be a more moral nation. It was the need not to repeat World War I, not to have boots on the ground in Europe. All of those were very important components of their message. There are elements of anti-Semitism that some people introduced to it. But by 1940, with the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, they were already declaring Europe lost.
Mhm.
They said France has no chance. It's over. Just they're done. Don't even worry about it. And Lindbergh stood, America's great hero, and he said, at this point, we realize Great Britain has no hope. We're going to have to work with Chancellor Hitler. Of course, the most famous episode is Neville Chamberlain
Yeah.
cutting a deal with Hitler. Do you see parallels to what's happening in the political world today?
Yeah. The Again, it makes my head explode. I'm having a hard time forming words to know that stuffed envelopes for Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and
Me too.
to see what Republicans are doing is just beyond belief. I'm represented by a guy named Randy Weber, MAGA Republican, probably in his 70s, maybe 60s. He's an agent of Vladimir Putin. If Putin were going to write a letter of request, hey, will you please do this? It's exactly what Randy Weber and hundreds of other House Republicans are doing in blocking aid. Our ally is literally under attack, and we're not sending aid there. But to go back to the 30s, the really interesting point, and maybe if this is some hope, there's always been bad people, and there always will be bad people. And in the 1930s, and I'm not even saying that they were necessarily bad, but there were isolationists in the 1930s, just like there are today. There were isolationists in the 1940s. The British monarchy had pro-German people in their own royal family. It wasn't until December 7th that most Americans said, all right, like World War II had been going on for years before we got involved. So we like to look back, kind of like the Russians like to look back fondly. We like to look back, we came to the rescue, and we did, but only after we did the right thing, only after we exhausted doing the wrong thing for a long period of time.
And it seems like a very big parallel is the huge battles that were taking place in Congress in the late 30s and 1940 about Lend-Lease and should we in fact be helping Great Britain. Here's Churchill. Churchill is making appeal after appeal after appeal. Help us. Please help us. Help us. If you don't help us, it will come to you. Please help us. And the America First isolationists, and I would just like to say, I think it's unfortunate that the term America First is hijacked, because it's not a bad term in and of itself. The idea that we want to care for our country first, I'm all for that. The idea that America should evaluate our priorities first, 100%, love that. But it's become connotated with really this sort of insane hyper-isolationism that says we will abandon our friends, period. We will just abandon them to the wolves. We will deify our enemies, and we will use international politics as partisan objectives, as opposed to a more transcendent approach to what's right, what's wrong.
Except for Israel. We're going to support Israel because we're Christians and God wants Israel to win. That's the really perverted. If you dig down into what's happening, that's what's so perverted about the GOP. I support Israel completely. I don't support Netanyahu, and I don't think he does what's in America's best interest often.
Netanyahu, it's very interesting, Terry, because for the first time that we know of in the history of the world, two major nations, the presidents of them are Jews. Both of these presidents, Zelensky and Netanyahu, both of them had family members killed by Nazis in World War II, by the Waffen-SS and others, both of them. Netanyahu played patty cakes with Putin for years, trying to keep a relationship with Putin. And you have these two men, and I guess Netanyahu, you would hope that he figured out when you play with the devil, it ain't going to end well for you. And it certainly didn't end well because, of course, Russia now is critical in this axis of evil between Iran, Hamas, China, North Korea, and Russia itself. But supporting, we don't know, we can't know for sure, for 100% at this point, maybe you do, whether Putin actually facilitated the events, but he certainly benefited from them.
Oh, yeah,
absolutely. He gave them aid and cover afterwards.
He could have said no, and he didn't. And
It
so
happened on his birthday, I think I heard.
that's interesting. But the greater point is they want a border bill and they demand all of these really extreme measures in the bill because we need border security. And the Democrats gave it to them. They literally gave them all the stuff that they wanted. And now because the orange man says no, it's bad, they're they're gonna put America at risk, allow millions of illegal aliens to come over just because Donald Trump doesn't want to give Joe Biden the victory. So as much as I love America, we have a very messed up political system right now. And I wish we could just talk about space. I'd rather talk about, Apollo and the space station and how we can get to Mars. That's the fun stuff. But the reality is we live here on Earth, and our political dysfunction might mean that people like Honor are going to be fighting Russians, and I don't want that, or other people too. And one of the things, and you've heard me say this, people are like, we don't want to start World War III. World War III has begun. It is Russia plus Iran and North Korea against Ukraine, aided by the West and Japan and South Korea and others. And so like there's a global battle happening right now. And if Ukraine wins, then I think it'll be the last battle of World War III. China will realize, hey, we can't mess with the West can be strong and they're going to stick together. If we aren't strong and we don't stick together, it'll be the first battle of World War III. So I think how these congressmen act, are they beholden to the former guy, or do they actually do the right thing, will determine if this is the last or the first battle of World War III. That's how I see things.
That's a very profound thought. It's a very profound thought. I hope our listeners will take that in and hear that, because I think behind a lot of people's perspective is just a fear. They're afraid of nuclear war. They're afraid of boots on the ground. They're afraid of everything that will happen. And your point is, we're already in this thing. It's there. But we could stop it now, which leads me to this question. Okay, we talked about World War II. And in retrospect, we look at the people that were appeasers not kindly through the lens of history.
Right.
Look at the approach of appeasement as something which is a failed policy. When we hear Mr. Trump, he speaks of strength. The concept is good. But in the past, when we spoke of peace through strength like Ronald Reagan did, it was the kind of strength that actually put fear in the enemy's mind. They said, okay, we need to think about what we're going to do. So this is what I want to, we're kind of now moving back into your time working with Russians. Can you help me to understand the Russian mentality, the Russian perspective in terms of weakness and strength? Mm-hmm. I'm grateful. I have so many differences with President Biden, I wouldn't know where to begin. I'm grateful that he acknowledges and wants to help Ukraine. For that, I will always be grateful, despite other differences I have with him, which are vast. But in any reality, I personally see him as a man who projects profound weakness, whether it's Afghanistan or his posture. And to me, that's like dumping chum in the water for sharks. Talk to me about this issue of appeasement historically and how that factors into the way things are going to work out in this new World War III we're dealing with.
Yeah. So the Russians understand force and they respect force. And it, the Ukraine is a military problem and it requires a military solution. So all these calls from Republicans and Democrats that let's negotiate, we'll negotiate with Putin. Ukraine already negotiated with them. That's just not going to work. Even if the war stops, if frozen conflict, it's going to start up again. The only thing that they respect is force. And the chum in the water is the perfect analogy. A very good cosmonaut friend of mine, most of the cosmonauts are not good people. Most of them are pro-Putin. They're actively or passively supporting Putin. But
aren't they military officers in the Russian army?
Not all, but some. Well, a lot of them are Russian Air Force. When they become a cosmonaut, they have to leave the Air Force and join the the NASA, their Roscosmos,
But
but
it's a position. You were a colonel in NASA. I assume they have ranked positions as well.
yeah, I flew with Anton Shkaplerov, who's a Russian Air Force colonel. And so yeah, many of them are former pilots. The insight that he gave me was, if we lose in Ukraine, Putin is gone. He said Russians don't tolerate military losses. And you look back at the last century, or a couple centuries, whenever they lose in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union ended, when they lost World War I, the Bolsheviks took over. When they, losing does not end well for the leader, which is part of Putin is literally fighting for his life. If they had a major victory, he would probably be killed. So that is something that they don't understand. And like with what just happened in Iran, we had to get attacked 160 times before we fought back. And then we said, hey, we're not going to actually attack Iran. And our main goal is to not escalate. And our main goal is to not bring the conflict anywhere. But don't worry, we're not going to bomb anything on the land of Iran. Well, Iran just armed and incited the invasion of Israel on October 7th. They've been attacking American soldiers for years. They run Hezbollah, they run Hamas. They're building a nuclear weapon, and they're sending weapons that kill Ukrainian civilians every day. Why does Iran still have a navy? Their navy should be at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. I mean, yes, of course we're projecting weakness. We spent the last 2 years, our North Star in Ukraine, the Biden administration's North Star in Ukraine, is timidity and fear. I am afraid of nuclear war. The Russians aren't going to start a nuclear war. Like, trust me, they're not going to commit suicide. A nuclear war would be a complete and total destruction of Russia. They're not going to do that over Ukraine. It took us a year. It took us a year to get one Patriot battery in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainians died for a year. Imagine if we had the COVID vaccine and we just waited for a year to send it out because we were afraid, right? It took us a year and a half to give them 31 M1 tanks. 31. We probably have 1,000 or thousands of those things sitting around in hangars collecting dust. The Russians certainly have thousands of tanks. It took us a year and a half to give them 31. They still don't have F-16. They still don't have ATACMS. The HIMARS missiles we've given them are the short-range version. And we literally have thousands of these weapon systems that would make a very significant difference on the battlefield. Everybody's like, oh, the counteroffensive failed last year. The counteroffensive failed because we were scaredy cats, because fear and timidity was our foreign policy. And the lesson that we've told the whole world, I mean, we've given a master class in foreign policy to the world, is don't worry, America's going to be timid. We're not going to come to the aid of our friends. You haven't talked about the 94 Budapest Memorandum. So we said, hey, Ukraine, give up your nuclear weapons and we'll respect your territorial integrity. The US, UK, and Russia all signed this agreement. And the world's third largest nuclear power got rid of their nuclear weapons. And then even during the Obama administration, we were encouraging Ukraine to disarm and get rid of this and that. And now here they are losing their country. And so
let's stop and let's talk about that for just a second. One of the roles that America plays different roles in the world, which are legitimate, valid roles.
Right.
But the most important role we probably play or should play, though we certainly have fallen short in different seasons and presently, is the role of a moral compass to the world. And that moral compass manifests in different ways. One way is, if we say something, we need to do it. If we say we're going to help you, we must do it. Mm-hmm. If we ask you to sacrifice greatly with the expectation that we're going to watch your back, and we don't do that, then we become the scourge of the earth, rightfully so, because we have broken our word to people who have trusted their lives on us promising them something. So here comes the Budapest Memorandum. A lot of people have tried to dismiss it. It can't be dismissed. Some people say, well, it isn't a formal treaty. What? It doesn't matter. the president of the United States representing America signed it. And it is the reason why Ukraine denuclearized. And the entire point of this three-way treaty between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, or this compact, not literally a treaty, was that all parties said, we will protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Right.
That was what it was about. So we don't really, something that my friends, my dear friends in the conservative movement, if that means anything anymore, something that my friends are almost blindly ignorant of is what a bunch of lying dogs the Russians are when it comes to treaties. They break all their treaties. They lie
100%.
voluminous about everything.
Yeah.
When it comes, or I should say, to be careful, about many things when it comes to their treaties and their histories. And you hear Putin constantly looking back, even the whole issue of the so-called independence of Ukraine that took place in the 1950s. He says, well, that was done illegally right now because, the Russian premier got drunk one night and he didn't have authority to do it. Everything is revisionism. Back to the Budapest Memorandum. If America is supposed to mean something to the world, to project integrity, project freedom, we can't tell people to make themselves vulnerable people on the planet and abandon them when it matters. And I would say that that's a very strong argument. And it's odd to hear people that represent faith, values, patriotism, argue for being treaty breakers and supporting mass murderers. Terry, I just came back from Bucha. That's a subject for another day. Honor and I were on the street talking to the eyewitnesses who watched boys raped by Russian soldiers, little girls, systematic execution of civilians.
Yeah.
This isn't a fantasy. It's a real thing that happened, and it's part of a whole mentality. But to your point on all these different things, the Russians look at in 2014, it seems to me, the Russians looked at the Obama-Biden administration's almost complete unwillingness to do anything over Crimea in the East, except slap the hand. And they said, great, weakness.
Absolutely. By the way, the Russians bombed Kherson last night, killed a mom and her baby.
Yeah.
It happens every day. Literally every day they're bombing somewhere. And the Ukrainians were shooting down 90% of the missiles. Now they're shooting down 50% because they're not getting what they need. So in the last couple months, the success rate of these Russian and Iranian missiles getting through has gone up a lot. Because
would that be fixed? Would that be fixed if we gave them more Patriots?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would also say, well,
Terry, I'm hopeful that, and we can maybe talk about this later, but I'm hopeful that you and I will be able to, and Honor and Ukraine Story Organization can work with you to produce the kind of documentaries that need to be told about this. If that happens, we'll probably find ourselves in Kyiv in not too distant future. But Honor, you and I lived through air raid attacks and felt what Ukrainians felt when we were over in Ukraine. I think it's really hard. The Brits understand it, who lived through the Battle of Britain and Hitler's bombing.
Yeah, but that was 90 years ago. I mean,
that was 90 years ago.
80 years ago. Yeah. So
but the fear, it's not like, oh, here comes another missile. It's okay, some people are about to be killed. Can we get to the shelter in time? Will we ever be able to sleep again? Oh, some stuff just dropped on my house. This is the normal. This is the new normal for life in the Ukraine. And this idea that Russia is waging some sort of a military war against soldiers, it's really misleading. This is probably, it certainly is one of the greatest a war against civilians that we've seen. It's
for
stunning.
sure, for generations. And my well-educated Air Force Academy classmates, some of them, they'll say, well, we promised Russia that we wouldn't expand NATO. And so they in their mind, it's like Russia has this right just to get a buffer zone, which is just the most perverted thing. It's like they think that we should go back to the 1800 world order where colonial empires just chose who was going to be on my team and who's going to be on your team. Um, the war in Ukraine goes against the fundamental premise of the United Nations is self-determination, right? Nations get to decide their own fate. And that's what really set Putin off. In 2014, there was the Maidan revolution, and he was pissed because the Ukrainian people threw out the corrupt Kremlin stooge president. And so he took over Crimea. He's such a vengeful, hate-filled man. To know that Ukraine was choosing to leave Russia and go to the West, he couldn't take it. So he did the first invasion, which, by the way, I saw that from space.
Okay, stop right here. Stop right here. You are, as I understand, I want you to tell the story, but I think you are the only man alive who isn't a Russian who actually watched Russia bomb Ukraine from 160,000 feet?
Or no, 250 miles or so.
Okay, 250 miles, from 250 miles in the air. Please tell us what happened.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, they've been doing this for the last 10 years. So there's been other guys who have seen this, I'm sure.
Take me to January 2015.
Yeah. So it was right after Crimea. It was after they invaded the Donbass and Luhansk. Of course, in the Russian lie-filled world, it was like the local People's Army rose up, but no, it was the Russian army that helped them fight the Ukrainians. And we were flying over. I was on the Russian service module, the Russian module on the space station. I was with a guy named Sasha Samokuchayev, my crewmate. He gave me a CSKA, Russian state hockey. He plays hockey. So I have like a Russian hockey jersey with my name on it. He was a good friend of mine. And we were looking at Ukraine at night, and it's pretty obvious because Western Europe has lots of lights. And once you get past Poland, there's hardly any lights anymore because it's poor. And all of a sudden there were these red flashes. We were watching bombs going off, and we were both we didn't say anything, like eyes open. It really hit me that I was watching Russians kill people on Earth from space. Sasha left the cosmonaut corps and joined the Duma in Putin's Yedina Rossiya, United Russia party. So he's one of their congressmen who were supporting the war. A lady named Yelena Serova was also with us when that happened. She was in the same module. She joined the Duma to support the war. Another guy that I flew with on my first flight to the space station, Max Sarayev, he joined the Duma. And there's a couple other cosmonauts who have joined Putin's party and are actively voting yes when they take away freedom for Russian citizens, or voting yes when they attack Ukraine. A lady named Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. She was a Soviet woman in 1960, 63 or 65. She flew in space for the first time. So she's a global hero. Every year on March 8th, on Women's Day, the NASA women all congratulate her on being the first woman in space. And she is a communist in the Duma, and she introduced a bill back in 2020, I think, a couple years ago, that made Putin a dictator for life. So she was the initiator of changing the Russian constitution to have this scourge against humanity in charge for life. So yes, those are some of my Russian cosmonaut colleagues.
And Terry, when you were up, you were in the ISS, the International Space Station, for 200 days plus.
The last flight was 200 days, yeah.
200 days. How many days total have you been in space?
A little over 7 months.
Okay.
213 or 15 or something like that. Yeah.
And am I correct that you have conducted more than 20 hours EVA?
I did 3 spacewalks, so something like that. They're scheduled for 6.5 hours, and so roughly.
How was that experience for you?
Spacewalking is pretty awesome. Like I had done a lot. I was an F-16 pilot, I was a shuttle pilot, but man, there's nothing like going out into outer space. You've got this thin little millimeter thick visor, you know, and on the other side of that is instant death. So it definitely keeps you on your toes. It's not something you do lightly. You know, it's a very intense, focused thing. Um, and it's awesome. You know, 99% of the time you're just working. My spacewalks were laying down power and data cables for the SpaceX capsules that are now going there. And also putting grease on the robotic arm. The joints were creaky, so we had to put some grease on it. And then I had a few moments where I would stop and look out, and it was like seeing creation. Like I was seeing creation from God's point of view. I was seeing things that humans weren't meant to see. I could hear him say, I am, like, here I am in the universe. And then I had to get back to work to plug the next wire in. So it was
As an,
pretty awesome.
I think every boy in the world who would hear you tell that story would say, man, I wish I could be Terry.
I would have said that when I was a kid. This is what I want to do. I'm so fortunate that, you know, I was able to do the thing that I wanted to do. So I'm very blessed in that way. And so I encourage you. I have a new book, or my latest book is a kid's is the Astronaut's Guide to Leaving the Planet. It's an illustrated book for elementary, middle school kids.
Oh, how fantastic.
Yeah, the book inspired me. And so I wanted to write something for kids to inspire them.
Terry, when I was a boy, my dad ran a government agency for the President of the United States and President Nixon. And so I was down at Canaveral all the time.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And I was when I say all the time, several times. And they took me up to see the Apollos. As a little boy, little tiny boy, I was hung out with the scientists there and in mission control and all of that. It got into my skin. It got into my heart. It never has left me. Years later, I became friends with the family of an Apollo 15 astronaut. I published a book about his mission to the moon. And there is a magnificent magic. There is something wonderful. Of course, it points us to the transcendent, to the creator of heaven and earth. Always. That's the destination. We always end up thinking God made this. Wow. Wow. And then back when the Virgin Galactic was first going up, I was trying to be part of a mission. Actually, we put the down payment down on a mission to go up in the Virgin Galactic to film an IMAX.
Right.
From 140,000 feet. We were trying to get the entire cabin to go up there and do it. And that didn't happen. But when I hear you tell that story, it's so beautiful. Thank you. And I hope you get to tell that your whole life. Kids need to hear that. They need to be inspired. By the way, we're talking about death, destruction, hard things on this show today. John F. Kennedy, whatever his faults were, he gave people a vision. It was beautiful. And that vision inspired people. It seems to me, as I look at the situation with Ukraine, here in America, the conversation is dark, negative, defeatist, conspiratorial to the core. There's nothing hopeful coming out. Honor, maybe you can comment about this, because Honor did a lot of interviews over in Ukraine on this point. Here's what we get from Ukrainians: hope, defiance, vision. If you ask a Ukrainian about corruption, here's what they're going to tell you: we hate it. We're going to finish it. We're done with it.
Yeah.
We want to be better. Yes, we're still breaking off the shackles of the old Soviet Union.
Corruption came from Russia. That's how the Russian system works. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the hope of these people, the beauty of these people, it's the greatest underdog story of our lifetime.
It is.
And I think that what your life has been about has been hope. The space program is about hope in many ways, or should be about hope. Let's put it that way. And the message you're sharing with us today, which is stunning, actually, is one of don't roll over, don't allow tyrants to destroy, believe in freedom,
Mhm.
stand with your friends, and let's go back to the ISS. What are these people? What are Russians actually like? Like you, I actually have a lot of friends who are Russians. I've lost friends who are Russians over this war. I
Mhm.
have a background where Honor and I, we have one great grandfather from Lviv, Ukraine, another
Wow.
from Russia. So we have our feet in this world,
Mhm.
and I think we see very similarly to you on this particular issue. But I haven't been in a space capsule with Russian cosmonauts.
Well, like I said, I loved my time in Russia. I love the language is tough, man. I speak French. I did an exchange in France. I minored in French, so like I could live in France and just speak French. Um, Russian is not French. It's a lot tougher. And I'm learning Ukrainian now, by the way, and it's not Russian. It's similar to Russian, but man, it is a different language than Russian. Anyway,
From
so
Pripyat to Privyet.
yeah. Well, right. You usually change one sound or add a letter or whatever. So the Russians that I met were good people, and there's a lot of things they do a lot of things right with their culture, and like they sent up when I was in space, they sent up sounds from Earth like rain, a cafe, jungle sounds, waves crashing on the ocean, and we fell in love with that. And that's because the Russian psychologists understand people and they know that we needed that connection. They give their crews a week or two before launch to just chill out and rest. NASA works you like a dog up till the minute you launch. So their crews launch rested. When they get back, they give them a couple weeks with their family at a retreat. I got nothing from NASA actually. There was no time off or anything. It was like get back to work. You got debriefs, and here's your next job. So the Russian they get some things right for sure, but their people are willing to live as slaves. Like they know that Putin is not good. Here's the one of the keys to understanding Russian. The other keys we talked about. They respond to strength. If we if Biden said, here's the vision, like Kennedy had a vision, the vision is Russia's out of Ukraine, the war criminals are held accountable, and they do reparations. Now let's go make that happen. Let's now generals, you make it happen, but there's my vision. We haven't
That's
done that.
great.
We
That's
haven't, we don't have, that's Zelensky has that vision, but he doesn't have M1s or F-16s, or what he needs is F-35s, not F-16. But anyway, so they understand strength. But they also, and this is a really important thing, the 90s sucked. The 80s weren't much better, but things really got worse in the 90s. It was a disaster. Grandparents lost their pensions. You know, the age expectancy went down 10 years. They lost all their prestige. Everyone thought Russia was a third world country. They're really self-conscious about it. The ruble devalued by 99% or something. So the 90s were absolutely awful, probably worse than the depression for us. And then Putin came along and things got better. Moscow's a nice city. It's modern, the subway works, you know, it's a if it wasn't a war, it would be a cool city to visit. And Putin brought them out of that time, and they don't ever want to go back there, and they want to have some pride in Russia. Unfortunately, what Putin has done, the world will never look at. Putin has destroyed the Russian brand forever, for generations to come. That ship has sailed, but that to understand that Russians respond to strength, and they're willing to tolerate living as slaves and being told what to do, and if they write something on Twitter, they go to jail for 20 years. They tolerate that because they made a deal with the devil. You get us out of the 90s economic disaster, and we won't bother you when it comes to politics. That's the social compact in Russia. And unfortunately, that like when you let a weed grow, eventually it'll take over your whole house unless you kill it. You know, like sin, unless you kill it, it's going to keep on growing, right? So the Russians have let that weed grow to a point where the damage is done. The only way, I don't know how they recover from it. And the real tragedy, so after World War II, Germany and Japan were completely defeated, unconditional surrender. actually with Japan, it was conditional. We let the emperor survive, but they were crushed and they were rebuilt. And look at them now; they're great. If you're born in Japan or Germany, you kind of won the lottery. Those are great countries. They're free. Russia was never defeated, so they've never gone through that cleansing process that they need to go through. And they're not. That's probably not. Well, for sure, it's not going to happen now. We're not going to invade Moscow and completely defeat them. So until that happens, it's going to continue to be a sick society. And if that were true, that would be bad on its own. But the problem is they also export that sickness to Ukraine and Iran and North Korea and everywhere else. So we could just say, let's not worry about it. It's a Russian problem, but it is our problem because they tried to mess with our elections, and every year, every time we have elections, they're actively interfering. I had a Russian bot create a Terry Virts Twitter account. I was like, I finally made it in life. I finally arrived. The Russians have hacked me. I'm worthy of that. So I was very proud of that.
Well, I'm hoping that before our work is finished in the months to come, should we have the privilege to make some films together, that you'll be on the official Russian no-fly zone list for entering. That would be a great badge of honor.
I was hoping to. I listened to Ukraine the latest. Well, by the way, it's a great.
It's the best. We love it.
I was on it actually. I was very proud of that. I was on it a few months ago. It's the Telegraph, the British newspaper, does it. Some really funny British guys, but they got sanctioned, and they had a couple episodes of being proud, patting themselves on the back for getting sanctioned. But
badge of honor.
Every time a sanctions list comes out, I look because I'm pretty actively anti-Russia, anti-Putin, but I'm small potatoes. I'm not worth it for them.
And I think a point just for viewers that may be tuning in or listening to this is that both you and I say this would be true for me, we have bonds and connections with Russian people, and some of those go deep. I have some very deep bonds with Russian people, but we've seen in our world, and I meet Ukrainians and Russians, and I hear the same story over and over again. A father can no longer speak to his child because he's supporting Putin. Marriages are broken, friendships are broken. It's caused a personal devastation beyond the military war, beyond the destruction of Ukraine, beyond the levels of war crimes that we're not used to seeing, is the emotional, spiritual destruction which has taken place with people and setting these nations against each other. So I think our hope would all be that the day would come when Russian people could be their best and the world could benefit from what they have to offer. But for right now, they are complicit in some of the greatest atrocities that we've seen since the Second World War.
They're actually supporting it, which is
they're not even complicit. They're actively right. It's even worse than that. Yeah.
And let me ask you about that. Do you believe that the Russians deny the war on civilians, they deny the war crimes, they deny the atrocities, or do you think they don't care?
They don't hear about it. They don't watch it. It's too much for them to see. When the war first started, I have a Russian neighbor, and we would have arguments all the time, and it was always, what about? But Ukraine just did this. Ukraine just bombed Donbass, and Ukraine's killing civilians there, but Ukraine did this, Ukraine did that, and you invaded Iraq, and which was the horrendous mistake. I wish we hadn't done that because they throw that back in our face all the time.
Agreed.
So it was bad for a few months, and then they just tuned out. I mean, Putin has made it. Life in Moscow is really good. All the Starbucks are there. They just change names. The McDonald's are there. They just change names. They get all the food they need. You know, a lot of European companies are still doing business in Russia. Turkey is completely helping them get around sanctions. China and India are benefiting from cheap oil. Like, this war is just given China and India a huge competitive advantage over us because they're buying oil $30 a barrel discount. The stands their exports of washing machines are up 2,000%, and so Russia is able to get around because most people in the world don't they don't have values, they just have interests. And so there's a lot of countries in the world willing to help things. Now, if you're from the Far East or one of the poorer villages, life sucks because all the men are gone and dead. So this is having a profound impact in the long term, but in the short term, life is not that bad in Russia. Yeah, there's inflation, yeah, a little bit unemployment, but it's my friends who have gone to Moscow recently, they're like, it's fine, it's normal. People are out walking in the parks. For the long term, though, Russia was already declining. Their trajectory downward is set for the next century. They've lost they've lost hundreds of thousands of men, but the men they're losing are not the A team. They're losing peasants and ethnic minorities. The A team is left, like they've gone to Georgia or Dubai or wherever. All the 28-year-old computer programmers and engineers and stuff, they've all left because they don't want to be conscripted. And they already had a demographic nightmare. They're losing population because life in Russia kind of sucks and it's hard to raise a kid. So they're in their reputational damage. The Russian trajectory here's some good news. The Russian trajectory is down for the next century, and the Ukrainian trajectory is up. Whatever the outcome of this war, Ukraine's going to be part of the West. Ukraine is going to be part of the EU. I think Ukraine is eventually going to join NATO. People really respect Ukraine. It's going to take time because Ukraine has also lost a huge number of young men and old men, actually. And a lot of Ukrainians have fled to Germany and England and wherever, and they're not going to, some of them are never going to go back. So Ukraine also has that problem. But the future for Ukraine, I think, is way brighter. It's just very painful in getting them to that future. And I wish we would stop being timid and reduce the amount. They're going to get there, but let's reduce the amount of pain required to get there. That's the message that I would have.